Block Tales Chapter 3 is out, and oh my god, this chapter was amazing. This game has so much potential, it's crazy. From the new enemies, dialogue, gameplay, strategies, areas, and story, everything about this chapter was perfect. But there was one thing on my mind after finishing Demo 3, and it was the lore. I did not expect Block Tales to do a 180 during the endgame of Chapter 3. So today, I will be talking about the lore of Demo 3 and what it could mean for our character and the people of Block Tales. But first, let's recap the story of Chapter 3. Spoilers ahead. To summarize the events of Chapter 3, after getting the Venom Shank, Shedlesky tasks us to visit Telemon's manor for the Ghostwalker. He gives us a train ticket and sends us on our way. Along the trip, we're attacked by bandits being led by Purple and Green, who have been chasing after Red and Blue in order to indoctrinate them into a life of crime. We stop them, and we make it to the manor. A butler welcomes us to the manor, shows us around a little, and ominously tells us not to follow him. So we end up following him anyway, and end up crossing through a mysterious gate, which causes us to enter a different world, I think, where the guests are replaced with the undead, and the manor actually becomes haunted. Exploring the haunted manor leads you to finding the kitchen wizard, who isn't happy to see us after our first encounter. But after we explain why we're here, he is willing to help us if we give him some ingredients. We give him what he needs, and he gives us a ghost potion to explore deeper under the manor. Under the manor is a catacomb, and in the catacombs, we're given the Hyper Bowl after defeating Slasher, allowing us to ground pound by double jumping. We use his new ability to break through the floor, and here we find the Ghost Walker. Terry warns us not to touch it since we'll literally die because we're not pure of heart, and says that we should find the kitchen wizard since he knows how to wrap up the Ghost Walker. We, as the brave yet stupid character we are, go for the Ghost Walker, and yeah, we die just like Terry said. We end up seeing Builder Man, who explains we're trapped inside the sword and need to purify our soul by exploring our mind, which will let us get out of the Ghost Walker. Within our mind, we are forced to confront our greed, our loneliness, our fear, and our hatred. We remove all of these negative traits within our mind, cleansing our soul, and wake up to finally claim the Ghost Walker and conclude Chapter 3. Now with that recap out of the way, we can delve deeper into the lore of our character to see what's truly under the surface. To begin, let's talk about the first emotion the player meets when we enter the Ghost Walker. And no, it's not greed, it's hatred. Hatred is first seen disguised as Builder Man. When he talks to us, he talks just like you'd imagine Builder Man to. He speaks about limitless possibilities and imagination. It's strange how even though he's attempting to manipulate us, he does give decent advice and motivation, and even convinces us to face our negative thoughts. Although in hindsight, he does this to not only break free from the Ghost Walker, but to corrupt our mind and take it over for himself. This leads me into an interesting theory that I will get into later, but for now, let's talk about the other emotions the player faces throughout their mind. Greed is the first, and I'm saying first with quotations by the way, emotion you'll come across while exploring your mind. It is a manifestation of the player's want for more, whether that want be items or money or the swords or even yourself. The master of 1,000 hands wants it all. When we finally find Greed's lair, we can see it's covered in ticks, which is kinda on the nose for symbolism, but oh well. Now what's interesting here is that the player doesn't actually go for the money. Builder Man is the one who tempts the player to take it all, and of course, since we're plagued by greed, we go for it and start dancing in the ticks as a sign of wealth, I guess. Greed swoops down and mocks us for falling for the oldest trick in the book. He also comments on how we brought a friend before attacking us. This comment is a little weird. Why does Greed call hatred our friend? Well, looking at what we know after claiming the Ghost Walker, our other emotions were aware of hatred. Solitude wanted to watch it, and Fear wanted to run from it. Both of them were aware that hatred wanted to end both of them, but greed wanted it. I believe the answer for this is actually quite simple. What I believe is going on here is that greed was just blinded by itself and didn't notice or didn't care that it was hatred, which ties in nicely with its concept. It formed when the player took the first sword from the cruel king, and by beating greed, we beat the player's inner struggle with wanting more power all to yourself. This ensures that when the player does obtain all the swords, they won't use them for their own malicious needs and will share their power with those around them. Loneliness is the second emotion you face inside your mind. It is the expression of isolation the player goes through. This is due to the fact that since the player comes from the future, they actually feel alone in the world and could feel alienated from the people around them since everyone they knew and cared about are all in a different time. It also stems from the fact that the player is the chosen one and has been singled out from the rest in order to gain the swords, meaning that the player has no one to truly relate to. While exploring further into Solitude's domain, we come across 4 symbols, those being the sky, the ocean, the moon, and the sun. Each of these fit in with the theme of Solitude. Only birds can fly in the sky, only fish can swim in the ocean, only astronauts can go to the moon, and the sun is the only star in our solar system. Before we confront Solitude, Builderman helps us by bringing out thoughts of separation, most of which are about the people we once knew, which could explain why the player feels this way in the first place and why this is one of the negative thoughts we must face. This obviously attracts the attention of Solitude, who watches us with one eye. It states to us that we are special and that it will not let hatred end it. Something of note during the fights, while the player moves around, the eyes in the background follow the player. It's a small detail that many ignore, but what this represents is the player's scopophobia, or the fear of being watched. The player could have developed this phobia because of the amount of people they need to help, and that could be weighing down on the player's psyche. This fear was developed from the beginning of the story when the player was first transported into the past. But by beating Solitude, we allow ourselves to connect with the people we meet and will no longer be worried about the future. Fear is the third emotion the player encounters. It is the representation of the player's unease throughout their journey. It comes from the fact that the player has been put in dangerous situations constantly and has always been forced to go through them, with the risk of death being prevalent without knowing what comes next. Within Fear's domain, the player finds himself exploring a forest. The reason his domain is represented this way is because a forest is direct symbolism for fear. In a forest, you have no idea what is in there with you. It is a large expansion that's easy to get lost in once you enter, and when the sun goes down, there is nothing but darkness and the shadows from trees. Although specifically, in this forest, we are not actually lost. Fear itself attempts to get the player to actually leave the forest. It knows it is not strong enough to face hatred and would rather save you to avoid it. Fear is by far the smartest emotion, as seen by it telling us that we are being manipulated and that greed and solitude were attempting to help us. This makes fear a more neutral emotion that can actually be used for good. We still have to beat it, however, because we have to purify our soul to escape the Ghostwalker. Interestingly, Builderman doesn't actually invoke our feelings in order to bring out fear, but rather fear shows itself to us. I figure this is because the player is currently feeling fear in the moment, as they have for every other encounter, and because our fear in Builderman is growing. Fear attempts to bargain for its life and tells us not to trust Builderman. However, it realizes that we already made up our mind by the time we confronted it and reluctantly fights. The player's fear was first manifested when Shedletsky tasked them with collecting all of the swords of time, and by removing our fear, we get rid of the dread that clouds our mind and will embrace any challenge with absolute certainty. Hatred is the fourth and final emotion the player faces. It is the buildup of the player's anger and self-hatred. This comes from the constant fighting we do in order to get the swords of time and the constant losing that comes along with it. Hatred was the drive behind exploring our mind and a factor that was in every battle. It was manipulating the player long before it disguised itself as Builderman, and by taking out all the other emotions, we fully gave into it, making it our most powerful emotion and nearly lost our mind from doing so. Before confronting hatred, the player first had to find the center of their veins, meaning that our hatred was so strong it even had a grip on our hearts, and once the player unwraps their heart and confronts hatred inside of it, hatred, doing what it does best, attempts to convince us to give into it once more and let it take full control of the player. It ends its tirade by saying it's the scourge of everyone, and the fight with the red thing starts. Hatred first formed when the player picked up and used a weapon, and grew the more swords the player gained, and by taming our hatred, we fight not with malice, but with justice and virtue, which allows us to utilize the swords of time without any drawbacks to our mind. Hatred's influence doesn't end here, however, as the theory I had on hatred can explain how it played a role in previous chapters and how it will continue to do so in later ones. My theory being, what if hatred can be found in all of the swords, and this is something that all sword wielders go through when they come into contact with a sword of time, but to a lesser degree than the Ghostwalker. We can see these signs of hatred with the cruel king and Griefer. The king mentions voices telling him that we destroyed his kingdom in the future, and he refers to the voice as tormenting. This fits the criteria for hatred, as it is both an emotion that attempts to corrupt everyone with its lies and torments the mind. Griefer also talks about the voice, but what's strange is that he hears the voice before he touches the Venom Shank. What is happening here is that hatred must have successfully taken control of Griefer somewhat, most likely due to Griefer already holding hate towards his father, and further manipulated him by telling him to claim the Venom Shank. What hatred would make Griefer do next is attempt to take out the player. This was in vain, however, as Griefer explained after his defeat that the voices knew he was going to lose. It was aware of the future and set him up. This was a course to allow the player to obtain another Sword of Time on purpose to try and grow their hate even more so that hatred could corrupt them more easily. This explains a lot of things about hatred. It is inside every person in the story, unless their soul is pure. It knows about the Swords of Time. It torments and controls those who are capable of using a Sword of Time. It knows who guards each sword, and it knows the future because the player comes from the future. Hatred is a worldwide threat. We need to stop this thing. Oh my god. What this means is that hatred will keep appearing in future chapters, either through a sword guardian or from someone that is capable of using a Sword of Time. It will control the sword user by giving out premonitions of the future, all of them being bad so far, and it will always warn them that the player is a threat, and since it cannot control us anymore, it's gonna kill us. Badly. Anyways, that wraps up this video. If you have any thoughts or comments or anything you'd like to add or take away from this, then please do so. If you enjoyed this video, then please like and subscribe and join the Discord if you want. This has been Super Derplux. Thank you for listening to me yap, and peace.